Back in the beginning of this year, we chose the theme of religion and ecology for Gesher for this year in reaction to the great disaster of the bushfires and the response afterwards in the terms of the discussion of the place of climate change and the sort of wake-up call that the bushfires were. We thought it was a very timely thing to speak of ecology in relation to religion. We didn't know that the big bushfires were not going to be the big thing of 2020 and that there was something even bigger coming along. The COVID-19 crisis may not, first of all, appear to be an ecological disaster, but it bears a lot of similarities to the crisis that we are facing in terms of climate change. And especially in terms of the responses that have been made, there are a lot of similarities in terms of what has been called for to respond to the imminent threat of climate change. The far more imminent threat of COVID-19 has produced some of the reactions that perhaps we would be looking for in relation to the wider view of our ecological situation. So after looking at some ecological issues in issue 1, this second issue has unapologetically focused entirely on the COVID-19 issue, and especially on the question of how do we approach the common good in relation to this. Now, after the launch, Colleen O'Reilly will be leading our contributors to the Gesher this year, our essayists for this issue, in a panel discussion on the issues that were raised in this second issue of Gesher in terms of COVID-19 and the common good. So we'll leave some of that discussion to them. Gesher is already up on the Council for Christians and Jews Victoria website. You will find this page, and you can see last year's edition here, and you can see the first 2 issues of this year's edition. Issue 1, if you haven't read it yet, issue 2 here. And you can use the download button to download a PDF version to your computer, or you can click on look inside and you'll get this lovely flipbook version that we've got here. Same cover. Don't be fooled, it's a new edition. We've again got Bev Hardich's cover on the front. I want to thank Gesher Editorial Committee, Philip Bliss, Newton Dado, Faye Haskin-de Broen, Alex Katz, Colleen O'Reilly and Mark David Walsh for their great contribution to this issue. In our contents, you can see that aside from greetings from the Premier and the Opposition Leader and our new Vice Chairman as he was, Chairman as he is now, Alex, we have artwork from Victor Masner, we have essays from Stephen Duckett, from Gordon Preece and Aviva Kipen, and we also have a poem by Abe Mesrich and a selection from Psalm 104 from Robert Alter, and messages from our presidents here today as well. I'm just going to show you, just as we flip over the page past the editorial, I want to show you this artwork that we have from Victor. Victor has provided 3 self-portraits on a familiar theme that punctuate the whole of the essay. And I think that's one of the treasures of this edition that we have. We're going to go to a presentation that we have from Professor Sharon Lewin, AO, the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity Director. And she is also a Professor of Medicine at the University of Melbourne and a National Health Medical Research Council Practitioner Fellow. She is a member of the Jewish community, and she has been dealing with infectious diseases and epidemics for a lot longer than we have. So let's hear from her now.
Good afternoon, my name's Sharon Lewin. I'm Director of the Doherty Institute, and I'm delighted to send a note of congratulations on the launch of the second edition of the second issue of Gesher, the official journal of the Council of Christians and Jews. And I'm particularly delighted to see that this edition is dedicated to COVID-19. I've spent my life working in infectious diseases with a particular focus on HIV and seen the power of science and community in tackling a major global health issue. This was very much the secret of success to our response to HIV and is our great challenge in COVID-19. Although the newspapers are filled with advances in vaccines, treatments, and the numbers of tests we do every day. The real test for our success will be on how our community is able to respond. So when I read about some of the articles in this edition which focus on inequalities, on spirituality, on the importance of community and the importance of kindness, I wanted just to emphasise how these issues are as important as any scientific advances. There will be a silver lining, I think, for COVID-19, and I think that much of that will be in how we treat each other. And so I am delighted to read these articles and wish you well in your discussions in the launch. Congratulations again.
So thank you very much to Professor Sharon Lewin, AO. I want to just finish our launch here by reading a story I've come across in the last few days. This story was written by philosopher Günther Anders, and I have it via Jean-Pierre Dupuy, his book, The Mark of the Sacred. And I think this bears in mind the future that we are looking at. Noah had grown tired of being a prophet of doom, forever announcing a catastrophe that never came and that no one took seriously. So one day he clothed himself in sackcloth and covered his head with ashes. Only a man who was mourning the death of a beloved child or his wife was allowed to do this. Clothed in the garb of truth, bearer of sorrow, he went back to the city, resolved to turn the curiosity, spitefulness, and superstition of its inhabitants to his advantage. Soon a small crowd of curious people had gathered around him. They asked him questions. They asked if someone had died and who the dead person was. Noah replied to them that many had died, and then, to the great amusement of his listeners, he said that they themselves were the dead of whom he spoke. When he asked when this catastrophe had taken place, he replied to them, "Tomorrow." Profiting from their attention and confusion, Noah drew himself up to his full height and said these words, "The day after tomorrow, the flood will be something that will have been. And when the flood will have been, everything that is never will have existed. When the flood will have carried off everything that is, everything that will have been, it will be too late to remember, for there will no longer be anyone alive. And so there will no longer be any difference between the dead and those who mourn them. If I have come before you, it is in order to reverse time, to mourn tomorrow's dead today. The day after tomorrow will be too late." With this he went back to whence he had come, took off the sackcloth, cleaned his face and of the ashes that covered it, and went to his workshop. That evening, a carpenter knocked on his door and said to him, "Let me help you build the ark, so that it may become false." Later, a roofer joined him, saying, "It is raining over the mountains. Let me help you, so that it may become false." We have reacted with great, we have put all resources, reacted with in great ways to help ourselves through this crisis of COVID-19 that is now upon us. The rain is already on the mountains. We need to be thinking of the things we can be doing for our ecology in the future, even though, so that that also may be false. I'll leave you with that story. Thank you very much. I will now introduce to you Colleen O'Reilly, who is going to introduce our panelists for today. Colleen is an Anglican priest. She is the chaplain at Trinity College and a member of our Gesher editorial committee. She is also a long-term member of CCJ. And she told us a story just as we were beginning today that in fact she has a Jewish ancestor who was a convict here to Australia. So over to you, Colleen.
Thank you, David, and welcome to everyone. We're now about to have a conversation about the common good in a time of crisis, and we're very grateful to the three distinguished contributors to this second Gesher who have agreed to join in this afternoon. I'm going to invite each one of them to tell us briefly what's the key message that they're wanting to convey in their article, and of course you'll be able to read it afterwards. Then I'm going to invite them to converse with each other, and from Zoom land you'll be able to ask questions. We have an hour for this conversation. And I'm sure that you will go away later thinking more deeply about what it means that we're all in this together. It's an easy enough slogan, isn't it? We're all in this together. And it's true as far as it goes, but it pastes over the big questions and it conceals the issues that are crying out for attention that we now really do need to reconsider from the grassroots up. This is a time for some radical rethinking as we ask, what is the genuine common good for all of us? So I'm going to introduce each speaker just before they speak. So let me first begin by introducing to you Dr. Stephen Duckett. Stephen is a distinguished economist. He is the director of the health program at the Grattan Institute here in Melbourne. You're very likely to know Stephen from his appearances on television. You might have even seen his sitting room before now. But you may not know that he's a member of the Religion and Society Policy Network of the University of Divinity, a fellow of both the Australian Academy of Social Sciences and Health and Medical Sciences. And in addition to that busy professional life, Stephen is the Vicar's Warden at St. Peter's Eastern Hill, at the Anglican Church there on the hill, which makes him a key leader, of course, in that congregation. St. Peter's is currently providing food and hundreds of meals each week to anyone who is in need at this time. A splendid effort on the part of the parish to contribute to the common good. So Stephen, over to you to tell us in a few sentences the key issues, questions and thoughts that you want to share with us this afternoon.
Thanks very much, Colleen, and thank you all for inviting me to be here today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that where I sit in lockdown Melbourne is the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And in an audience like this, it's probably useful to start with a verse from the Nevi'im from Zechariah, and do not exploit widow and orphan, sojourner and poor man, and do not plot evil in your heart, each man against his fellow. And that's from the Altar translation that you have been republishing in the Gesher magazine. But it's the classic statement about the quartet of the vulnerable that we see throughout both the Hebrew scriptures and the Greek scriptures. And what I want to highlight is the issues of inequity in the COVID crisis. First of all, people who are vulnerable are more likely to be infected. We know, if you look at the map of Melbourne that appears in the Age every now and again of where the infections are, they're more frequently in the poorer suburbs, especially the western and northwestern suburbs of Melbourne and the outer southeast. Secondly, people in poorer suburbs or people of lower socioeconomic status are more likely to be affected by the lockdown. So the incidence of the lockdown falls unevenly in society. People like me are able to work from home. People in the hospitality industry and casual employment are not. Our structures and policies have impacted adversely, especially on low-income people. For example, they don't have pandemic leave. They haven't until recently had access to pandemic leave. And so there are a whole set of fissures, I guess, in society which have been highlighted by the pandemic. And I've suggested, I've outlined a bit of that in the piece in Gesher, and also have made some recommendations about what we should be doing. And part of it is talking about it, to tell the story. Part of it is about advocating to ensure there's a bit greater equity in the responses and how we manage these things, especially for the aliens in our midst, as they might be called, the asylum seekers and so on, who are not eligible for job seeker and job keeper payments. And also we need to make sure that the economic response the recovery response includes addressing things like social housing, which have contributed to the poor social housing has contributed to the pandemic. So I'll stop there just to start the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. Wonderful start. I'm now going to introduce you to the Reverend Dr. Gordon Preece, who, like me, is a fellow Anglican priest. And Gordon is the Senior Policy Officer of Catholic Social Services. He's Director of the Ethos Centre for Christianity and Society, and he chairs the Melbourne Anglican Social Responsibilities Committee, as well as being very involved in the University of Divinity's Network for Religion and Social Responsibility. He's written and edited 13 books so far, as well as caring for the Yarraville parish until recently. And I first met Gordon in the 1980s in Sydney, and now here he is with 3 grandsons, just as I have. So Gordon, over to you.
What I want to address, and thank you for the invitation to be involved here, and it's a great privilege in listening in on all the great work that's being done. I've tried in my paper, which is called Lives, Livelihoods and Lockdowns, to look at some of the tensions that have been raised about, say, weighing up almost on the scales of lives versus livelihoods, for instance, the economy versus, I might call it the social ecology, or weighing up in some of the ways it's been put, the sort of generational justice issues between the elderly who are most vulnerable to the coronavirus, as we're seeing it tear through our aged care systems, and the younger generation who have been most vulnerable in terms of livelihood. And you hear people, particularly economists, some, I don't think all economists by any means, but some, and some philosophers like Peter Singer, for instance, who want to say, well, we need to basically do our sums and try and come up with what is the greater social good or the greater social benefit. And people use things called the trolley dilemma. And if you're heading along on a sort of streetcar trolley and you're about to collide with a whole bunch of people, but you see that there's another rail that you can go down, and if you quickly adjust the direction and you grab hold of that lever, or you're thinking about it, and there's one other person who's standing on that other rail, and so you do your sums and you accept those consequences. And what people, ethicists like me, usually do, they say, because people kind of come up with alternatives, and well, what if something happens, or this, or various alternative ways of construing the thing. And it's always said, well, no, you can't do that. You've just got to stick with it the way it is. I think that, frankly, stunts ethical imagination. And it also leads to us losing a sense in using the universal to swamp the particular. And if you like, almost using statistics to swamp the stories of particular people and what affects what's called the qualities, some people call it. They say, and when you face a dilemma, you add up the years of quality adjusted life for, say, a younger person versus an older person, if you're weighing up triage issues in a hospital situation. The trouble with that is that we don't know all of the picture, and we tend to have often it's a very, well, it may sound objective and quantified, it's often from a very subjective and also power-based position with our own biases, whether it's racial or age or various other sorts of things. What I try and propose against that is I draw on 2 sources. One is a disability activist, Harriet Mcbride Johnson, and her story, which she talks about, particularly in relationship to Peter Singer, and the Singer's kind of inability to understand her situation from the inside, and as to whether her life is really worth living or not. The other one I've drawn upon is Daniel Fleming, a Catholic bioethicist at St. Vincent's, and he questions the trolley dilemma and talks about things that they have been able to do at St Vincent's in completely aligning their system in order to be able to cope with COVID-19, to completely equip the old McCullum Hospital for Cancer, to have that ready in very, very short time for COVID-19 patients, and also other examples of housing the homeless in hotels. And so there have been many examples. We could say the repurposing of medical equipment as well, to show what social imagination can actually do. And I want to appeal to that kind of social imagination so that we don't enter into a zero-sum kind of game with the lives and the livelihoods of people. Sorry, that was longer than 2 sentences, but
that's fine. Thank you, Gordon. That's marvellous. And now I'm going to introduce Aviva Kevin, the Reverend Rabbi Dr. Aviva Kevin. We'd have you, Aviva, but you belong to another community.
Thank you.
Who has served the common good through ethics committees for the past 20 years. She is currently a member of the Ethics Committee of the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services and the National Health and Medical Research Council. I first met Aviva over 20 years ago when she began doctoral studies in what is now the University of Divinity. And with substantial interfaith experience and formal qualifications, Aviva is a spiritual director and a pastoral supervisor whose expertise and wisdom is available to you. And if that sounded like a plug, you've understood. But Aviva, we look forward to what you've got to say to us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colleen. I've been listening to the previous 2 discussants, and I'm so aware that I've tackled this question about an ecology of COVID from a spiritual dimension with very little reference to the overt agenda of social policy, even though I hope when you read my article, you'll understand that I'm trying to infer into the COVID space a great deal about a landscape in which very few of us have any real ability to control the outcome. And that's not because we're helpless, but because the scale of the challenge is much more than the scale of the parish or the denomination or even the faiths, one at a time. So there is an invitation in that. I don't engage with the details of the how to fix, but I do certainly acknowledge that when I was anticipating the submission date and knowing that it was still a couple of weeks away from the day when we would be launching today, at the time, I think I estimated the number of cases worldwide at 19 million and deaths something shy of 1 million, but of course that was a guess on my part. And both of my colleagues on the panel today have been talking about the immensity of challenge and difficulty. And one of the things I say in my article is relevant to this whole enormity in which we can only assume our contribution within the scale of our level of influence or the people with whom we work in communities. And that is that scale is relevant because it tests the extent to which ideas that we formulate in the abstract must be applied in the changing fastness of this new disease worldwide. So we have to calibrate ourselves against the immensity of something in which we are individual players. But the invitation of my article in the magazine that you'll be able to read shortly is that although the disease is beyond most of us, and we're very thankful to have scholars and researchers of Sharon Lewin's calibre working in teams around the world, all of whom are working on different models to attempt to get to vaccine solutions, and all of them working in largely different ways and meeting each other in consortia so that they can try and get verification across sites, so that there is some validity in the emerging work that they're doing to try and get a vaccine. The challenge in the meantime is the one that we're in fact rejoicing in this afternoon and experiencing, which is I've been to several annual meetings of different organisations since COVID started, and all of them report more attendances online than if they were face-to-face meetings. And what I'm suggesting is that we've all of a sudden expanded our understanding of COVID through COVID to redefine the nature of the community and to expand its reach, because we have the capacity to do it. It's not perfect. Alex, when you took the chair and moved us to the next part of the meeting today and we went to the Gesher launch, I thought, oh yes, this is exactly 50 minutes into the meeting where we really all needed a moment to get up and have a stretch and sit down again. But that's because we've learned how to do that. And we've learned how to do that because by and large, we've had to be adaptable, and leadership has had to respond to the demands of the fact that if we want to stay connected to each other and enjoy a spirituality that's going to contribute to a morale that enables us to keep functioning in the face of tremendous difficulty, then it's because we reach out to each other and we find the way to do that. A small aside here, when you launch the 36th anniversary of an organisation like the CCJ, there is an immediate message that I can share with you, and I know that all of the Jewish participants in the meeting know it already. 36 is 2 lots of 18. Chai and Chai, life and life. Jews and Christians in partnership in this organisation that make the magic 36. But what's the 36? It's the mystical Hasidic teaching that there are 36 people in every generation who travel in a hidden frequency. They're not identified. Nobody officially knows who they are. But their task is to travel in the world and through their work to plant acts that have a spiritual and a morale boosting and a spiritually quantitatively improving influence everywhere. So if that's not an opportunity for me to link what I'm saying in my article about the nature of an emerging civic spirituality as a response to COVID, to the deeply embedded understanding of what it is that God calls us to do, even at times like this, whether we do it quietly through organisations like CCJ, whether we do it quietly by grooming leaders to step into the roles that we will hopefully soon vacate, because most of the people on screen today should be identifying their successes immediately so that we can replace ourselves in the spiritual landscape. It seems to me that actually there's been a much more faithful response in the community than my pure philosopher and my pure economist colleagues are inviting the community to embrace. And it is that I think prayer has been everywhere, and the search for something that sanctifies the struggle has been palpable, but it's broadcasting on a new frequency.
Thank you, Aviva. Thank you. Well, we've had 3 very interesting and stimulating presentations from the authors of those articles, and I hope that before sunset you'll have read them. Certainly gone to the website and downloaded your copy. We're in unprecedented times, and we're faced with issues that we thought we would never be faced with personally, as Aviva's talked about, and corporately as communities. So I'm going to ask each of the 3 speakers, are you hopeful? Do you think there is a will to find a way forward? And can we possibly find a way forward that is going to bring about remedies that will leave us in with the silver lining that Sharon spoke about? I don't know who'd like to go first. Maybe perhaps you, Gordon, or Aviva. Do you want?
Okay.
I just wanted to clarify, when you say remedies, do you mean remedies in response to the clinical challenge of COVID?
No, well, that's a part of it, but no, I meant, I had in mind the much greater remedies to the social ills that have been uncovered. The kinds of things that Stephen was speaking about, the quartet of those who are left behind. And this is, I think, one thing we're all agreed on is that our clever present arrangements, which look so smart economically, have really come unstuck, and we have been brought home to the reality of how many people we've been leaving behind as others have become increasingly prosperous.
I'm happy to kick off.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. Go ahead.
Look, I'm hopeful in some ways. The examples that I mentioned in relationship to, say, St. Vincent's, in relationship to homelessness, and the I used to be at Urban Seed, which is just behind Collins Street Baptist, and we had a homeless ministry there, and so that's pretty close to my heart. And I've noticed that the government has actually responded to seeing that getting homeless people off the streets and into hotels, and some people have been able to kind of reconstruct their lives in some ways through that, and so they could have easily been a major disaster area in terms of COVID and lack of isolation, both for themselves and for others. But the government's come up with plans to really extend that, build on it. This is the Victorian government, I should say, and build on it, because Victoria has much less social housing than anywhere else in Australia. Actually, it's quite surprising, and I think we're about 3.4% of social housing to other housing, and I think it's about 4.5 average across the nation. So, so some of those examples from civil society, if you like, I think give me encouragement. But I also think that on the ecological side, I think at the moment, because we live in an ADHD, attention deficit disorder kind of world, and the media highlights one thing, we have the bushfires, and then we forget about them, and then we have the pandemic, and people don't make the link, but that through climate change and invading the habitats of various exotic sorts of animals, which then people end up eating for a range of reasons, that can be quite disastrous in terms of our interactions. And so we really need to connect the two things, which David was talking about earlier on. But when I feel, if I'm tempted to despair, and I do the sort of grandchild test for my 3 grandsons, which we use in ethical investment, which I've been involved in, and I do have some real fears for them. But there's an article in The Age by Peter Hatcher, just basically arguing that both political parties at the federal level are out of touch, and in actual fact, businesses, investors, and others are investing in renewables, etc. People are starting to try and address things, and there is some hope there. So, yeah, I think there are, we do face very, very big challenges. When we join the dots, the challenges are enormous. But we have actually seen through the pandemic where civil society really does seek the common good and has a different kind of social imaginary, and realize how incredibly precious people are, that we cannot come up with some very effective responses.
Thank you. And Stephen and Aviva, would you like to respond to that issue as well? Stephen?
Thanks. So my view is the pandemic has shown that governments can respond, and what was previously seen as impossible and unthinkable is now possible and thinkable. And so the amount of money, for example, that has been spent on social support through JobKeeper and JobSeeker, for example, and other programs, is beyond our wildest imaginations. A few this time last year, for example. So that means we can think about what a stimulus program will look like and should look like as we move out of this lockdown phase. And as I said, social housing, especially in Victoria, is one of these that we should be thinking about as an area for government investment, both state and federal. And if you look at the numbers, in the public housing estates in Kensington and Flemington, I think there's 20% of the population are living in overcrowded accommodation. That is, they don't have enough bedrooms for the number of people that are there. And so we should be addressing that, because those are incubators for infections, but they're also unjust. And so I think when we're looking at reconstruction, we're looking at the stimulus programs, we should be actually applying an equity lens to those to say, how are those investments just, and how will they address the issues of the quartet of the vulnerable?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. Aviva, did you want to respond to that?
I think I'd like to have a go at the bigger ecology of a world that is polarizing to the right at exactly the time when the needs of individuals seem to be more and more demanding. I was fascinated to listen to Jonathan Swan, the young journalist who has interviewed Donald Trump a couple of times and who happens to be Norman Swan's son, speaking about Trump and saying, I actually don't think he wants to govern, he just can't bear to lose. And if that's the best thing that you can say about the contender for a second term in the White House, then the ship is being commanded by a 3-year-old who hasn't yet learned how to lose at games. It's a very scary proposition, and I do have something to say about Boris Johnson and Donald Trump in my article. Yes. Not least to thank Boris Johnson for getting a terribly serious dose of the COVID and nearly dying, because in fact he did great service to leadership by demonstrating that this is not a myth and that it will affect even the most blokey of blokes. And therefore the male leaders of the world who appear to be exerting a disproportionately large amount of power at the moment had better bloody well pay attention. On the other hand, you get Brazil saying our economic model is not to be tampered with. P.S. I'm sure Stephen will confirm that if you take 300,000 or 400,000 people out of an economy of a city, there will actually be an economic impact on that. So it's not as though it has no impact. It's just a myth of let's solve, quote unquote, we'll solve the problem of the favelas by making them disappear, by a piece of deliberate social engineering, if not to save the people who live there. But then to have a different kind of roll-on consequence, which modelled a position of laissez-faire economics as legitimate social response to COVID. So my concern about the ecology of this is that we have an international leadership climate which is demonstrating that 70 to 80 year historic swing that we've seen so often before, which is bringing us back to maybe not quite 1936 Berlin, but not so very far away from it, where public policy to eliminate the most vulnerable, and this is an echo here of the most early social engineering policies of the Third Reich, didn't start with eliminating Jews. They started with eliminating profoundly disabled Christian babies who were multiply handicapped and who were euthanized. And that was offered as illness in childhood that couldn't be prevented, but was later disclosed in the Nuremberg trials as a systematic public policy to reduce profoundly handicapped individuals from the population. And what I see is an international climate which is much more worrying than small local climates, where we have growing awareness but great confusion. And I'll give you the example for this one. Some of the people on the screen today know that my husband Phil is a regular letter writer to the Australian Financial Review. He is an electrical engineer who has over many years become quite expert in alternative energy. And listening to him watch the news is a sight to behold, because he speaks back to the television. And you should hear an electrical engineer listen to the good news stories about solar panels on rooftops. You know, this is one of the great myths of scale that I was referring to before. If the government takes away all the buyback certificates, trust me, your house system isn't going to actually profit you ever. But furthermore, it will imperil the national grid, because the way it feeds irregular kinds of currents into the overall supply and demand peak load, in fact, is not good for the total picture, even though it might make you feel better. So for me, the bigger challenge is not our individual level of awareness, but a real lack of enough information that enables us to make broad enough decisions to get policies right, even if we've got the will. And I hate to invoke the name of that other redhead, but she said today, even if there's a vaccine, no one has the right to insist that she be vaccinated. Okay, what's the definition of democracy, and how fine is the line between the public good and requiring that people do things? They don't let babies into baby care unless they've had their triple antigen and their measles, mumps, rubella, and now thankfully there's a vaccine for pneumococcal and a whole lot of other things, and we can require those. But there is a big ethical problem worldwide about what constitutes the right decision. And if you were to try and get all of us into a room with Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump and a couple of those other leading free thinkers, I think we would not reach a conclusion. So am I optimistic? Only to the extent that worldwide systems regulate themselves, but not because it's going to be pleasant to go through the next cycle. I think the next cycle could be quite unpleasant in all kinds of ways.
Quite costly by the sound of it. And it's that balancing of individual responsibilities and rights and the common good, and the discrepancies that we're increasingly seeing between those with the decision-making power and the desires, the hungers of ordinary people for something more and something better. We've heard from the panelists, and thank you for all of that. It's over to you in Zoom land. You may have questions or comments that you would like to make. So please just unmute yourself. That's down the bottom on the left-hand side, and ask your questions of the three panelists who are looking forward to engaging with you.
May I butt in with a question? I was madly
David,
typing
please.
it in the chat box already. I've done this with my university classes. I've got them to get a copy of the, and I was reminded of this by Aviva's comment about, say, possibly compulsory vaccinations. I got them to look through the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and identify all the rights that have been curtailed in order to deal with the crisis that we have in front of us. I'd like to hear from our panelists about what happens in, and it happened recently with the Victorian Charter as well, when people who were supposed to be isolating were insisting they could still go out for their daily walk, otherwise it'd be imprisonment. So I'd like to hear from the panelists about the relationship in a time of crisis to those things that we would normally count as human rights, and in terms of the common good, what sometimes the steps are that we might have to take.
Okay, thank you, David. So over to the panel. Who would like to respond to that? Stephen,
I'll have another go.
Right, Gordon. Good.
I think we have to be fairly careful that things that you allow for a certain period of emergency thinking do not, through lack of democratic discussion and debate, and we've had a lot of, our parliament's been on hold, etc. We have the, not the National Council of Premiers, but the advisory committee of people largely from the fossil fuel industries, who are now under cabinet rules of confidentiality, so that their conflicts of interest, etc., cannot actually be looked at.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think this is a major problem that's going on. And so what I'm saying is that you can justify temporary suspension of perhaps of certain human rights, like let's say relatively unlimited mobility or whatever, given the broader considerations, because you're always balancing human rights. You're balancing rights of freedom of religion and schools, of religious bodies, in relationship to sexuality issues. That's been a recent one that's still debated, but has been put sort of on the back burner because of COVID, etc. So you're always doing that. The issue is how to do it transparently and have genuine democratic discussion and debate, and access of all parties to that kind of debate, and those vulnerable parts of society that are often either invisible or inaudible in relationship to those debates, and to make sure that their voices are heard. Otherwise, we can easily get both dictatorial governments, but also the kind of crisis capitalism that Naomi Klein has talked a lot about, where in effect you privatize the Iraqi economy after the war, and you do the same thing in New Orleans. That's what's happened in the US, and both have been disasters.
Thank you. Stephen, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, thanks. And I've got a view somewhat similar to Gordon's, that individual rights have to be held in tension with the broader community as well. And there is no right way of dealing with that tension, so that there will always be, as Gordon said, a situation where the rights are curtailed in the interest of others. And so, although I'm a strong supporter of individual rights frameworks, I always think of them in that tension. Catholic social teaching, for example, is very clear that we have to think of person in community, not just of person. And so in this particular circumstance, our rights are curtailed in the interest of the broader community's rights. And as Gordon said, we've got to be careful about how long that goes on for and what are the implications of that and so on. But they will always and are always in tension.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, Zoom landers, it's your chance to Denise. Denise, thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. I'm interested to hear the conversation about competing rights, and one way of expressing that is of one set of individual rights in relation to another set of individual rights, or perhaps individual rights in relationship to rights of the community. But I wonder whether, in the context of the conversation about the ecological situation that we're in right at the moment, to draw upon the learnings of ecology and eco-theology to consider the relationships instead. And from a religious or a spiritual perspective, that might be to even consider something like covenant relationships, where instead of speaking about competing rights or the rights of one person or group against another, to speak about the responsibilities and the balancing and the tension, not of right against right, but of rights and responsibilities. And so the question in relation to should a person be required to be vaccinated, is that acceptable or not, or is it an infringement of human rights? The conversation could be in relation to, does the person have a right to make their own choices? Yes, in certain ways. And what does that need to be balanced with? The responsibility to the wider community that the actions of the individual are exercised in a way that respects the whole of the community. So it's a responsibility aspect, and it's a relational issue. And the drawing upon an ecological framework is that we're all interdependent in the way that we relate with each other, and the impact of any one little particular part of a wider network or ecosystem has a ripple effect upon all others, and any action we make always has that impact upon others, and that perhaps is a different framework altogether rather than just to speak about competing rights. I wonder whether there might be some comment in relation to that kind of different framework.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. Over to the panel.
I'd just like to make an ecological observation to stretch the metaphor a bit. In every ecosystem, there are predators and there are maladapted organisms. So, you know, even in a well-orchestrated scape in which nature has come to its proper stasis, it doesn't take a lot to bring out an imbalance. And in order for systems to balance, there has to be a reasonable amount of predation and a reasonable amount of overproduction. So in fact, if we look at that model, it's not a very peaceful one. It requires a great deal of competition, and it requires that a whole lot of characters on the landscape are going to get knocked off. I also wonder whether when we as people of faith talk in terms of covenant, whether we can find another way to use a language that people who see themselves as completely outside faith frameworks would be prepared to engage with. And I think that's part of what I was attempting to do in my article, to notice that while a whole lot of people say, oh, that all that God BS, I'm not into all of that, or I've left the church because the institutions are so appalling, are so corrupt, have damaged so many people, whether there isn't still a deep, profound level of yearning to which we can attend, but without trying to label it overtly. Let's just be divinely subversive and find a wonderful way to start the conversation so that our language is coded and we know that it's the language of true holiness, but we won't tell anybody. So they don't know and they don't have to get nervous about it.
Yes, indeed. That's a challenge and a half. Would it? Oh, I see Lorraine. Lorraine Parkinson, you have a question? You'll need to unmute yourself, Lorraine. You'll need... Oh, okay. I think you were being affirmed there in that comment.
Could I give one quick example?
Yeah, of course, Gordon, go ahead.
At my daughter's wedding in front of a convict brick wall in the middle of Tasmania about 10 years ago, her husband didn't want to have a very religious kind of service, and so I ended up, I preached on Nick Cave's song that we had played, Into My Arms, and which starts off I don't believe in an interventionist God, etc., etc. But darling, then it goes, but darling, I know you do. And then he gives various examples of what I'd call God the intimate interventionist, and in loving kind of relationships. And it was interesting to see the way people responded to that. This was from a very trendy kind of branding and fashion kind of creatives, inner city Melbourne group. And I think there are ways of trying to talk about connection, like people ecologically talk a lot about that in green groups and others, and ways in which we can mix the personal and the natural and material kind of languages that in making connections, and ways we can kind of thicken up from just short-term commercial contracts through to language like covenant or other ways, through various analogies that might have a certain amount of cultural cogency. And I think that's where it comes down to social imagination and the kind of language that we use, and really listening long and hard to some of the cultural prophets like a Nick Cave or various others in our society, and seeing how we might be able to make some of those connections.
Thank you, Gordon. Stephen, did you want to respond to any of that?
So thanks, Colleen. So if in my charitable self, when I'm thinking about the compulsory vaccination, I can think of the Prime Minister being ambushed by the shock jock into that answer, and that he hadn't really thought it through, and he has since backed away from it a bit. The reality, of course, is that we may not have a vaccine, and if we have a vaccine, it's not going to be around for sometime next year. So what we should be thinking about now is not who is going to be the last to be vaccinated, but who's going to be the first to be vaccinated if there is going to be a vaccine. And so the ethical choices about who goes first. In my Machiavellian times, I think that it was a deliberate ploy to continue the debate about vaccination. It had nothing to do with whether you're going to have compulsory vaccination or not. It was just to keep that debate going, because the politics of having a vaccine are very, very good, even if it is paper. It's not a reality at all. So so my view is that the compulsory vaccination debate is a distraction, either inadvertent distraction or a deliberate distraction from the underlying questions that we started talking about. What should our society be like? What should the rights, how do we balance this rights and responsibility, if you take Denise's alternate framing, or responsibilities and responsibilities, I guess. And so that we should keep our eye on the big things about what should be done, and not get focused on the ephemera.
Thank you. That's always the challenge, isn't it? To keep with the heart of what matters in the dilemmas that face us as a community, as a society, not to be distracted by what the media simply want us to talk about, or what the politicians want us to focus on, but how to keep alive the conversation about what is really at the grassroots level. What's the radical conversations that we need to be having about the situation we're in? And as we noted earlier in this whole gathering, who'd have thought this time last year that anything like this would be happening to us? It's quite extraordinary times that we find ourselves in. And as a group, I pray each morning with my colleagues at Trinity, and we pray to be equal to the circumstances. And I think this afternoon, I'm just about to wrap up because we need to close, but I think this afternoon has given us an opportunity to hear from people who've been thinking deeply about these matters. And it's given us an opportunity to start doing our own engaging at that deeper level, so that we are indeed equal to the times that we find ourselves in. And who knows, let's hope that the 36 are silently moving among us and quietly transforming our world. It reminded me of a story from the Benedictine tradition where the abbot was having trouble with the monastery, and so he said to them, I want you to know that though I do not know who it is, the Christ is among us, and you may be speaking with him today. And life in the monastery improved immensely because they each started to treat one another with much greater consideration and in the end with much greater love. So from each of our traditions we have wisdom to get us through, but there is a much bigger debate, of course, to happen. So thank you very much to Aviva, to Gordon and to Stephen. Thank you for writing for Gesher, and thank you for making yourselves available to us today. We really do appreciate it. If I could, I'd give you a bottle of wine each, but what I'll promise to do is have a nice glass of something and I'll send you the full detailed tasting notes. How about that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to hand over to Alex Katz, our new chair, who is going to conclude the afternoon for us. Alex.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, everyone. As you agree, this was a most enlightening and fascinating discussion. And of course, if you want to read more about this, then please log on to Gesher. Send it all around to your friends, to your neighbours, to your colleagues, to anyone you know. Tomorrow, I believe we'll be sending it out to our distribution list so that everyone will have a copy and a link to that. I wanted to, it was remiss of me earlier to not, if we were meeting in person, we would have provided Thilo, our outgoing chairman, a gift. I believe his phone died, so he's left the meeting, but we actually sent him a gift on behalf of the council, which he received during the week. And so I wanted to acknowledge that's being done as is tradition and as we should have done, to thank him for his service. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that it's really lovely to be able to be part of this and to put this on. And I think at one point we had 51 people, which is quite significant for an online function of this type. What's been particularly good about the council and the involvement of the committee that's been involved is that we've been able to very quickly pivot to doing this all online. I think if you saw in the presentation earlier, we had 2 events in March that were face-to-face, and then immediately in April we had an online event, our first ever, and a number of events since. And so I think I want to thank and congratulate the members of the executive and the council who've been so much a part of being able to put these events on in the world in which we live in this online format, and that of course includes Gesher. So thank you to our panelists again. Thank you to Colleen for moderating, to David to be as the editor, for Mark for hosting this event, the rest of the committee, and we actually at the moment don't have another event planned immediately. Our next Gesher will be in November, so look out for that. We may not have another event before Rosh Hashanah and the festivals that come up in the Jewish world. So Shana Tova to everyone to whom that applies. And otherwise, have a great afternoon and we'll see you next time. Thank you.